Welcome. I am Heather Jones, Senior Counsel for Financial Disclosure at the Office of Government Ethics, and one of the attorneys who worked on the LEF regulation team. This is a how-to training on how to establish a legal expense fund and how to review and approve it. We will have additional how-to trainings in the future, one on completing quarterly reports in December, and one on terminating the LEF in the new year. We will also have a live question and answer session on November 8th, which is shortly before the regulation goes into effect on November 21st, 2023. I also want to note that this training is specifically regarding legal expense fund trust. There isn't information about the acceptance of pro bono legal services. That information is provided in a separate training. Next slide, please. In the overview training, we discuss situations for which an employee may want to set up a legal expense fund trust. For the purpose of this training is to explain the steps an employee will need to take to set up a legal expense fund trust and find a trustee and begin the process of accepting contributions. The requirements outlined for employees in this document going forward are also the requirements that ethics officials should look for when they're reviewing the trust for approval to ensure the information that is needed is included in the trust documents and to ensure that the trustee meets the requirements of the regulation. This training will also explain the rules for contributions and distributions and the employee's recusal requirements for the trustee and for donors to the trust that need to be considered as soon as the trust is established. The information in this training is also covered in the Employee's Guide for Legal Expense Funds, which is available on the OGE website. It is the most comprehensive guide regarding the legal expense fund rules. I really recommend that you consult it for information about this. Also, there's a lot of information in these slides, but everything in the slides is also in the employee guide. So if you have any questions, you can go consult the employee guide or back up the slides and watch again. I really think of this training as an opportunity for you to get some red flags in your mind or things you need to be thinking about, but really use the guide as your tool to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements when you set up your trust or you review your trust. Next slide, please. The types of legal matters that an employee may use a legal expense fund for are limited. Arising from the employee's current or past official position is one type of legal matter that can serve as a basis for a legal expense fund trust. For example, imagine a Central Intelligence Agency employee is facing an administrative disciplinary action due to an issue with the employee's security clearance and would like to seek financial assistance to pay for an attorney. Because this matter arose with their official position, the employee may establish a legal expense fund trust to help pay for the legal expenses for that legal matter. Employees may also set up legal expense fund trusts for legal matters arising from the employee's prior position on a presidential or vice presidential campaign. For example, if you had a Federal Election Commission investigation into the expense payments made by a presidential campaign, the Federal Election Commission staff then seeks to interview a former campaign staff person who is now an employee of the Executive Office of the President about their knowledge about the payments. The employee may establish a legal expense fund to pay for the legal expenses because the legal matter arose from the employee's work on the campaign. Employees may also pay for legal matters arising from their prior position on a presidential transition team. For example, an employee who now works at the State Department was in a car accident while traveling on transition team business. The transition team and the employee are sued by the other car's driver in the accident. If the employee needs to retain their own legal counsel, they may establish a legal expense fund to help pay for the legal expenses because this matter arose in connection with the work of the transition team. Remember that legal expense funds may not be used for personal legal matters. So if our State Department employee in the previous example had a car accident while driving to pick up their child from soccer practice, the employee could not use the legal expense fund to defray any legal costs. Simply put, legal expense funds are only for legal matters that came up because of the employee's government job. For purposes of our presentation today, we're going to work with the example of a singular employee, Caroline Smith, who works for the Department of Interior. She is being investigated by the IG for misuse of government resources while on official travel. Here, the employee would have the option of establishing an LEF because her legal matter arose because of her official position. Next slide, please. Our employee in the example is wondering what she needs to do to get the process of setting up a legal expense fund started. The first step OGE recommends is reaching out to the agency's ethics office to get advice about the options for getting help with legal expenses, which aren't limited to just legal expense funds, to get an explanation of the process for setting up a legal expense fund, and getting information about the resources available to help the employee. And those resources are going to be highlighted throughout this training and largely can be found on the OGE website. OGE recommends engaging a trust lawyer who practices in the state where the employee lives to draft the trust document. So OGE encourages ethics officials to let the employees know they should hire someone in their state. We understand that hiring a trust lawyer can be very expensive, so we have created model trust provisions to assist either the trust lawyer in writing the trust to help defray some of those costs, or so the employee can use them if they decide to use an off-the-shelf trust document when setting up the trust. The employee also should start thinking about possible trustees, someone they would trust to manage the assets of the trust properly. And we'll explain the requirements for being the trustee in this training shortly. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of the first page of our model trust provision document. It contains sample trust paragraphs for every paragraph that OGE needs to be a part of the trust as required under Subpart J, or the LEF regulation. It does not contain every provision that the trust will need to be legal under state law because trust laws vary from state to state. You can find this document on the OGE website under Resources for Federal Employees, and there is a tab there for resources related to legal expense funds. Ethics officials, you can use this document as a checklist for the provisions that should be in a trust document. The trust document does not need to match word for word the model provisions, but the provisions in the employee's trust document should have the same legal effect as those in the model trust document. And note, we do not expect ethics officials to be experts in trust law. Many of us aren't. We're working in the field of ethics. That's why we've drafted this model trust provision document, and your responsibility for reviewing the trust is just to ensure that the provisions in the model trust provision document are covered in the trust document. Next slide, please. This slide provides a list of the general trust provisions that each LEF trust document must contain. We're going to walk through them with our Interior Department employee, explaining what each trust provision should look like for her. The trust should indicate that Caroline Smith is the grantor and beneficiary of the trust. Note that Ms. Smith must be the only beneficiary of the trust. The stated purpose of the trust is to accept contributions and pay for legal expenses in connection with the Department of Interior IG investigation into possible misuse by Ms. Smith of government funds while on official travel. There must also be a provision indicating that Ms. Smith, as beneficiary, may not control the assets of the trust, and that the only benefit she can receive from the trust is payment of legal expenses related to the IG investigation. There is also a provision requires that indicates that the trustee and any successor trustee must not be the beneficiary of the trust, the spouse, parent, or child of the beneficiary, a federal employee, a foreign national, a foreign agent, a lobbyist, or a person whose interests may be substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the beneficiary's duties. Finally, there is a provision indicating which state's laws will govern the trust. Our Interior Department employee lives in Denver, so the trust should indicate the Colorado law will govern the trust. Next slide, please. This next group of slides discusses the rules around accepting contributions and giving out paying expenses. The provisions discussing permissible and prohibited contributions contain the information about contributions that we will discuss in the upcoming slides. I strongly encourage you to consult the Model Trust Provision document for this portion of the trust document as a checklist for agency ethics officials. You just need to make sure all the rules about who can't give to a trust are included in the trust document. The provision for permissible expenses should include what is permissible under the regulation, which also will be discussed in detail more later in this presentation, and that is limited in any way by state law that governs the trust. So we have rules about proper expenses, but state law may also have its own specific rules. There also must be a provision that requires the trustee to let donors and payees know that their information will be posted on the OGE website. Another thing to consider when drafting the trust provisions is whether you as an employee will pay the trustee for their work. This is often called trustee fees, and it is permitted under the regulation. And trustees often like to be paid because being a trustee can be a time-consuming job. Next slide, please. Finally, there must be a provision in the trust that requires the trustee provide our Interior Department employee with the information that she would need to fill out quarterly reports. And if she's a financial disclosure filer, the gift section of the financial disclosure report that she filed. The provision should also require the trustee to provide information to the filer so they can meet their recusal obligations, which are discussed more in detail in this presentation. The trust must require that it be approved by the Interior Department and that the trustee provide a copy of the trust to the agency's ethics office. There must also be a provision discussing what will happen with any excess funds once the trust is terminated. And these are the trust provisions that are required by Subpart J of the Standards of Conduct. Next slide, please. When the Interior Department employee is considering who to have as a trustee, they should think about these important trustee duties. The trustee must act as a fiduciary and as a result operate the trust in the best interest of the beneficiary. The trustee has exclusive control over the trust property, meaning that the employee is not involved in the management of the trust. They must be good at managing money and keeping records of what is coming in and going out of the trust. They will also be responsible for filing the trust's tax returns. The trustee must ensure that the trust operates in compliance with Subpart J, the state law, and the trust document, such as providing the Interior Department with the employee with the information that they need to fill out their quarterly reports. So these are very important responsibilities to consider when you're deciding who would be the best fit to be your trustee. Next slide, please. When our employee is considering who can be their trustee, there are categories of people who are automatically disqualified by the regulation from being a trustee. For example, the employee, their spouse, child, or parent may not be a trustee of the trust. Any federal employee, no matter what branch they work for, may not be a trustee for an LEF trust. A foreign national, this is someone who is not a citizen and not a lawful permanent resident of the United States. A foreign agent, nor a lobbyist may be a trustee, nor may someone who has interest that may be substantially affected by the employee's performance or non-performance of their work. And we'll unpack this requirement in a minute. You will see that it carries through the regulation into the contribution section as well. Next slide, please. So the standard of a person or someone who has interests that may be substantially affected by the employee's work carries through a lot in this regulation. With regard to LEF trusts, both employees and agency ethics officials will need to consider this standard for both who can be a trustee and who can donate to a trust. Unlike the prohibited source rule in the main gift rule, the bad prohibited source standard here is a little different. For subpart J, the focus is on the employee's duties rather than what the agency does as a whole. This is not a new standard for ethics officials, just so you know. It is in other parts of the reg. It's just something we've carried into the gift rule for the first time. If, for example, in this case, our Interior Department employee works on contract awards for the department, she would need to consider the people and companies bidding on contracts that come before her specifically for purposes of this standard when deciding who can be her trustee. If there was an individual who had a sole proprietorship whose company was bidding on a project and she was reviewing that contract, that person could not serve as trustee for her trust. In this case, our employee has selected her sister to be the trustee of the trust. She's good with money and she has bookkeeping experience in Colorado. And there's no overlap with her Department of Interior position. She meets all the requirements in the regulation, so she could be approved as the trustee. Next slide, please. This slide provides the steps for approval of an LEF trust. There's a lot of steps. I know it seems daunting, but we'll walk through them one by one. First, our employees should provide a copy of their draft trust document and the information about their proposed trustee to their agency ethics officials. Agencies may have their own established process for submission of these documents, so employees should check with their agency ethics official if they have questions about their agency process. Second, the agency ethics official will review the trust document and the information about the trustee to see if everything is in compliance with subpart J. They should check if the legal matter qualifies as a covered legal matter. They should review the trust to see if all the required provisions are included. And they should review the trustee information to ensure that the trustee qualifies under subpart J. Third, we encourage the agency ethics official to provide the trustee with an electronic copy of the trustee's handbook and the LEF trustee guide for information collection compliance. Both of these documents are available on the OGE website Employee Resources page. Within 30 days of receiving the trust from the employee for review, the agency ethics official should let the employee know if they've identified any issues in the trust or if they're going to approve their trust. If they find no issues, then the DAO should approve the trust in that 30-day period. This is a short timeline so that the employee can get legal assistance engaged as soon as possible. If the trust is not approved, the employee should work to correct any identified problem and resubmit the trust documents or find a new trustee and give that information to the agency as soon as possible. Once the trust is approved by the agency, the employee should execute the trust document, which usually means signing the trust document in front of a notary public, and then provide a copy of that executed trust document to the agency. At this point, the employee and trustee can start raising money for the trust. Agency ethics officials at this point should keep a copy of the document for their records, but also transmit a copy to OGE for posting on the OGE website, and in some cases for second-level review of the report, and an ultimate posting by OGE. Please send the document to LEF at oge.gov, and that web address is also available in all of the resource documents. You can find it. OGE will complete second-level review on the reports it reviews for financial disclosure and all White House employee trusts. OGE will reach out if they identify any issue in the trust documents or with the trustee, and at that point, employees may be asked to further revise the trust or possibly find a new trustee. But that's only for reports that OGE completes second-level review for. Next slide, please. One of the first things our Interior Department employee and her trustee will do once the trust is approved is to begin to solicit contributions for the LEF. Both the employee and the trustee need to be wary of the misuse of position standards in the standards of conduct. For example, the employee and the trustee may not use the Interior Department seal or Interior Department letterhead in any solicitation or on a web page seeking solicitations, nor may the employee use her government hours or computer or phone or staff at her direction or any other resources to raise funds. The solicitation that they do make for funds can reference her position at the Interior Department and the legal action that the funds are being raised for. OGE recommends that the employee consult with ethics officials about any solicitation materials to ensure that they comply with the ethics regulations. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about people who can contribute to a trust. There are 4 categories of permissible donors to an LEF. They are individuals, national party committees like the DNC and the RNC, presidential and vice presidential campaigns, and certain 501c or C3 organizations. We will discuss each group in detail, starting with individuals. Additionally, we have a model donation format for trustees that they could use to ask donors if they're in one of the prohibited categories. This is just something that could be used on a website to collect information about the donors or given out if they're sending mailings. And that model format is available on the employee resource webpage on the OGE website. Next slide, please. Individuals allowed to donate are divided into 2 groups. Those who are unable to give to any federal employee legal expense funds, and those who can't give to the particular employee based on the employee's official duties. So this first slide goes to those who are not able to give to any federal employee. An agent of a foreign government, as defined in 5 U.S.C. 7342A2, cannot give to LEF. And there is a link to the DOJ website to look up foreign agents, both in the employee guide and the trustee guide. A lobbyist, as defined by 2 U.S.C. 160210, who is currently registered pursuant to 2 U.S.C. 1603A, and there are links on in both the trustee guide and the employee guide to look up whether someone is a lobbyist on the House Clerk's website and the Secretary of the Senate's website. A foreign national may not give. That is someone who is not a citizen or a legal permanent resident. Nor can a person who's donating on behalf of someone else or at their direction. This does not allow someone to give money to someone else and have them give. It also means you can't disguise a donation from a business. That's the purpose of not donating on someone else. And you cannot be an anonymous donor and make a donation. You have to provide your name in order to donate. Next slide, please. These prohibitions are specific to the employee or agency that the employee works for. So someone who is seeking official action from the employee's agency, in this case the Interior Department, may not donate to the legal expense fund. Someone seeking to do business or doing the business with the agency, and note this needs to be an individual seeking to do businesses with the agency, cannot give to a legal expense fund. Someone who is regulated by the agency unless the regulations affect a large and diverse group, like all taxpayers or all passport seekers or all Social Security recipients. Again, these are individuals. Someone who is substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the employee's duties. And this is the very same standard we discussed about to use for trustees. Nor may officers or directors of an entity substantially affected by the employee's duties. So in this case, if our Interior employee worked on granting contracts, she could not accept donations from the officers or directors of companies that bid on the contracts that she's personally working on. So she needs to think about all the companies bidding and make sure her trustee is checking to make sure the officers and directors of those companies aren't donating to her legal expense fund. Next slide, please. A campaign or party can donate to a legal expense fund, but they must be qualified as a federal campaign under federal campaign finance laws. The FEC website is a good resource for checking on the qualifications of a campaign or party committee. There are links in the employee guide to the FEC website to find this information. Additionally, the campaign can't give if their work will be substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the duties of the employee. In this case, it's unlikely to happen for an Interior Department employee to have to worry about a campaign or party donation. Finally, campaigns can only pay for the legal expenses for someone who worked on the campaign. The campaign can't pay for every employee. Next slide, please. Certain 501c organizations may donate if they meet a specific criteria, and you can look up whether an organization is a 501c on the IRS website. The link to where you can look that information up is contained within the employee guide. The 501c3 must be established 2 years before the legal matter that is the subject matter of the trust started. Additionally, the 501c3 may not be substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the employee's duties. If our Interior Department employee was reviewing grant applications rather than contracts for the department, and a 501c3 was an applicant for a grant, the employee could not accept a donation from that organization. Next slide, please. Note that a single donor, either an individual or an entity, may not contribute more than $10,000 in a calendar year to a legal expense fund. It's important for the employee and the trustee to keep an eye out for this limit. Any amount that is accepted over $10,000 must be returned to the donor. Next slide, please. If there is an impermissible donation to the trust, it must be returned to the donor before the next quarterly report is due. If there aren't enough funds in the trust to return the donation, the employee will have to provide the funds to the trust return the donation. So this is why employees, it's important for you also to keep an eye on the contributions to the trust and make sure you're not getting impermissible donations. Next slide, please. Now we're moving on to the expenses that the trust can pay for. Expenses related to the legal matter that is the subject of the trust may be paid for by the Legal Expense Fund Trust. Here it's the IG investigation, and this would, if it were a court case, include filing fees, court reporter fees, expert witness fees, copying, in addition to any attorney's fees that you're paying. You can also pay expenses related to soliciting funds, such as setting up a website to collect donations or hosting a fundraising event. You may also use money for administering the trust, expenses for administering the trust. That would include trustee fees, record-keeping software, things like that. And finally, the trust can pay any tax liability it has. For example, the trust may need to pay taxes to both the federal and the state government. Next slide, please. Our employee is required to recuse from party matters in which the trustee is a party or represents a party from the moment they become trustee until 2 years after the person stops being trustee. This is not likely an issue for our Interior Department employee, but if the employee worked on party matters or worked with individuals, for example, if our employee was an attorney at the DOJ, they could not work on any party matter where the trustee was a party to the matter or was the lawyer representing the party to the matter. The employee also must recuse from 2 years after the most recent donation totaling $250 or more from any party matter in which the donor is a party or represents a party. This sounds complicated, but if someone gives you $250 during the year on March the 1st, you cannot work on a party matter involving that person until after March the 1st of the next year. But also, for example, if a 501c3 made a donation of $5,000 in January 2024 to our Interior Department employees' LEF, the employee could not work on party matters involving the 501c3 until January of 2026. If the same 501c3 gave another $5,000 donation in January 2025, that recusal obligation extends an additional year until January 2027. Next slide, please. This covers the substantive portion of today's training, which was focused on what an employee needs to know to set up an LEF. But we wanted to point you to some resources that are available to you on the OGE website. First, the OGE has issued a legal advisory addressing the new LEF requirements. That is LA 2305, which provides an overview similar to our overview training. OGE also has another number of other additional resources. There are some resources on the ethics officials page, and there are some resources on the resources for employee page. There's a handbook for LEF trustees, a guide to LEF for employees. Then you have the OGE Form 601, which employees will be using for their quarterly reporting. You'll have model trust provisions. And so these are all available. Once again, I'm just going to say the employee guide provides the most comprehensive overview of the requirements and can really serve as sort of a reference manual for you in reviewing trusts and in setting trusts up. Hopefully you'll find these resources helpful. We'll be holding future nuts and bolts training sessions focused on how to fill out and review the Form 601. The first of those are due until January 30th, so that training will be in December, and how to terminate an LEF after the first of the year. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for reviewing this training today. If you're an employee and you have questions, you should reach out to your agency ethics official. If you're an ethics official, feel free to send questions to lef@oge.gov or to contact your desk officer. Thank you so much again for your time today.